give you a productive way to do this, how to drive Hamas out. You make a peace deal with the Palestinian Authority. That buys them the credibility to be able to say to the Palestinian people, we have delivered a state for you, the thing that we have been looking for our entire lives. And now, because we have delivered that for you, we are going to run Gaza. That can drive Hamas out in a way that is organic and driven by the Palestinians themselves. If you just try to murder as many civilians as possible in Gaza, that is not an answer for actually getting Hamas.
Okay.
And by the way, the bombs have shown that they do not affect the tunnels.
Okay.
So all they're doing is killing civilians.
Let me bring in Mosab Hassan Yousef. You're the son of one of the Hamas co-founders, of course, renounced that back in the 90s. You believe that Israel should finish the job. They should eradicate Hamas.
Well, absolutely, because all the calling for a ceasefire is calling for surrender. They want Israel to surrender to the terrorist savages and sit down at the table and negotiate with them. And this is absolutely rejected.
Is there any deal to ever be done with Hamas? You know Hamas very well, obviously, through your father. Is there any deal to be done with a group like this now?
There is no deal with the devil. There is no deal with Hamas as long as they pose a threat against children, against civilians, and destabilize security in the entire region. If they get away with their crime, and their crime is not just any crime, it's a genocide. If they get away with their crime, what will they do tomorrow? They have to be punished and they have to be held accountable. All the calling for ceasefire, those are the people who want to give a lifeline to Hamas. And this is not acceptable.
Mosab, you tweeted on Friday something that many people found incendiary. You said, never trust anyone who identifies as a Muslim. They may appear as a harmless sheep when they are alone, but when they're in a pack, they will begin to show their tusks. I have zero respect for any individual who identifies as a Muslim, and I may consider the use of force when it comes to Islamists. What did you mean by that? Many people have said, well, why would you say that about, over 1 billion people?
Well, I don't care how many they are. Any person who put the religious identity above the highest interest of humanity, I have no respect for these people. The majority of the Muslim people identified with Hamas, supported Hamas. Show me how many Muslims out there who condemned Hamas genocide. Why? Is it because Jewish blood? This is what I meant. That the Muslims, as long as they give Hamas cover, I have no respect for them. As long as I identify as Muslims, I have no respect for them.
But I've interviewed a number of Muslims on this show who do not support Hamas and have renounced them. Cenk himself came on the show before and immediately denounced what Hamas did on October 7th.
I am dealing with a majority of Muslim countries, governments, an entire nation. Don't tell me about an individual here or there. We're talking about a majority of Muslim people.
Well, I'm talking about. Well, I'm only saying that because
who fail to take their moral responsibility.
Understand,
they
but
fail to take their moral responsibility because it's Jewish people.
I understand, but you did say literally every Muslim. You said don't trust anyone who identifies as a Muslim. That's all of them. And what I'm saying to you is I've interviewed many Muslims on this show who are not extremists, who do not support what Hamas did, who believe what they did was a terror attack.
But they still have the need for a religious identity, which is a false identity. Individuality is something else. Freedom is something else. A person who know who they are above all national and religious identities. There is no need to pose as a Muslim in a critical time in the human history. This is the time to take moral responsibility. What's the point of identifying as a Muslim while people threatening to erase an entire Jewish community? This is not acceptable. This is why I want the Muslim to stand and be clear.
Okay.
Up to this point, I haven't seen the Muslims taking a moral stand, a firm stand against Hamas. You know why? Because they are Muslims. because they are Muslims against the Jewish people. And this is where I want to push the Muslims to the point where they need to stand firmly and say, it doesn't matter if they are Jewish or Christians. A genocide is a genocide and is rejected. Hamas is rejected. I want to see this clearly.
In the last 2 hours, a letter from a number of Conservative members of Parliament has gone to the Foreign Secretary David Cameron, in which they're demanding that the UK no longer abstain on resolutions calling for ceasefires at the UN, and saying thousands of bodies lie under the rubble. In particular, a number of women and children have been killed is profoundly shocking. Too many Palestinians have died. And then this key line, by any measure, we are witnessing a catastrophe of precisely the kind the 1949 Geneva Conventions were supposed to prevent. What is your response to that?
I think they're wrong. I think Israel, as you said correctly, Piers, Israel is acting to defend itself, to destroy a brutal and ruthless and horrific enemy, Hamas, which is guilty of the most terrible crimes against humanity. And our challenge here is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities when Hamas, of course, embeds itself amongst the civilian population, in neighborhoods, in hospitals, in schools, in mosques, and so forth, even in UN facilities. And so we're trying to be as surgical as is humanly possible in a very difficult combat situation.
Let me interrupt you there, if I may, because you say you're being surgical, and you always say this, that you're being very precise, very careful not to kill civilians. But in the last 2 days alone, we've seen 3 Israeli hostages who had no shirts on, who had a self-made SOS banner that they were holding. They were clearly not terrorists, and they were shot dead by Israeli forces. And then we have these 2 women killed outside a Catholic church in an act the Pope has called terrorism, based on his information that he's got from the Archbishop in Jerusalem. This is, I'm afraid, not indicative of a fighting force that is trying to be surgical or precise. It is actually lending, I would say, support to the notion that President Biden put out, that it's indiscriminate.
So let's talk about those 2 issues specifically. Let's start with the 3 hostages who were tragically killed. You know, the fighting in Gaza, in that particular part of Gaza, has been very intense, close quarter combat, face-to-face fighting, and it's very difficult. And our soldiers claim, and this is being investigated, of course, that obviously they perceive the 3 as a threat, incorrectly and tragically. You know, in all sorts of urban warfare, you have what the experts call blue on blue shooting.
They were waving a white
friendly fire.
They were waving a white.
There hasn't been
a white piece of cloth with SOS. You know, they were clearly not Hamas terrorists. Unless you've been killing a number of Hamas terrorists, you've been waving white cloths with SOS and surrender on them, which I don't think you have. These people were killed, and they were turned out to be Israeli hostages. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy. But to simply dismiss it as sort of blue on blue, it seems to me it wasn't an accident. They were deliberately killed, and they were literally holding a cloth saying SOS. I mean, it's hard to think of a more blatant killing of innocent people than this, isn't it?
It's worse than blue on blue because they are civilians. They weren't even combatants, yes? And they were freeing, obviously, running away from Hamas. One of our problems in this was the soldiers on the ground did not have a briefing that they could expect to see hostages walking down the street, so to speak. We expected to see hostages in tunnels, in dark rooms, imprisoned. And the idea that they'd be walking around somehow free was a surprise.
Why
and wasn't
would they
expected.
Shoot anybody holding an SOS banner? Would they shoot a Palestinian that was doing that? A Palestinian civilian?
Your assumption, which could be correct, Piers, but it also might be incorrect, is that the soldiers who fired the shots saw all that. And this has to be investigated. Obviously, when it was over, all this was discovered. But we have to find out, and it has to be investigated, what did the soldiers see at the time? It's clear that they perceived that this was a threat. And we know that there was fighting in that area. There was hostile fire from the location, more or less, where the where the three were coming from, both before and after this tragic event. So we have to investigate, we have to get to the bottom. But I can tell you this, the chief of staff of the Israeli military, the most high senior officer in uniform, he spoke publicly earlier, and he said very clearly, of course, that the idea of shooting someone who is holding a white flag and so forth, that is against our code. That's against our rules of engagement. He was crystal clear, and he even stressed it's not connected to them being hostages. Even if they had been Gazan Palestinians, that would have been wrong behavior against our code of conduct. And let me explain why. For two reasons. One, for moral reasons. It's against the morality of the army, but also from a tactical point of view, because if you can take prisoners, then you get information, you get intelligence.
So how is this
in other words, the idea. So it was obviously it has to be investigated, but the chief of staff said clearly this is against our code of conduct.
What has happened to the IDF soldiers who fired the bullets?
So there's an investigation going on, and the question is, what did they see?
Have they been withdrawn from the battlefield?
Well, first of all, we have to see what the investigation comes out.
How do you investigate if they're still out there fighting? Have you brought them back?
No, I'm sure the ways the military does these investigations is always very thorough, because we want to learn the lessons. And let's be frank, the families of the three people...
Just to be clear, do you know if they're still in active fighting, or whether the soldiers,
I don't know, Piers.
or whether the soldiers responsible have been withdrawn?
I don't have the answer to that question. I simply don't know. I can ask the military and get you an answer.
I mean, surely you would agree with me. It'd be pretty extraordinary if they're still out there having committed this atrocity. I mean, it's what it is. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's also an atrocity. 3 hostages who were literally fleeing for their lives to what they thought was the safety of their own side have been just killed in cold blood, having held a sign up saying SOS. I mean, at the very least, I think the world would expect that the people concerned who fired those bullets have been withdrawn from active service until this is properly investigated.
So once again, I'll ask the IDF, but I can say the following, that there was no attempt at all to try to hush things up. We openly admitted this. The army came straight out and spoke to the families and said this was a terrible accident and it will be looked into and there'll be a thorough investigation. And the evidence and what the investigation reveals will be shared with the families of the 3 hostages who were killed. We're going to be, the army is going to be very transparent on what's happened here. We owe it to ourselves so these things don't happen again, and we owe it to the families.
Are you going to be as transparent about what happened at the Catholic Church that the Pope described as an act of terrorism, and given the Archbishop of Westminster says he simply doesn't believe the IDF when it claims it didn't do it?
So we'll investigate that as well. We are in the process of doing so.
Now, you're an atheist, but what do you think of that, of this idea that it's actually really about religion?
Well, I'm going to agree with him. I think it's interesting to note that many of your listeners will doubt my ability to make the statements of a sort I'm now going to make, but they can't doubt that of him, right? I mean, he obviously knows whereof he speaks, right? You can't play the identity politics game with him and say that, you know, he doesn't understand the culture, he's the wrong skin color, he doesn't speak the language, et cetera, et cetera. So let's let's flag that particular qualm with what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is it should just be obvious to everyone, which is that we have a vast number of people in the Muslim community worldwide, not just in the occupied territories or in Gaza, who are powerfully deranged by religious symbols and their religious identity, which is to say it is the most important thing to them, but more important even than the deaths of their own children, right? We're talking about a culture, again, I'm not talking about just Palestinians, I'm talking about the Muslim community worldwide in dozens of countries that has produced a seemingly unending supply of suicide bombers over the last 50 years, right? We're talking about societies where phenomenon that should be impossible are simply to be expected. I mean, literally like rigging children to explode. Just that, I mean, think of how deranging that is for an army or a police force or an NGO or anyone to have to imagine that a child isn't simply a child, but a child might, in fact, under certain circumstances, be a bomb, right? I mean, that is the situation we're in. We're talking about a society, and now I'm talking about the Gaza and the West Bank in particular, where in their schools, they teach 6-year-olds the love of martyrdom, the literal aspiration to die as a martyr, and the hatred of Jews. And many of these schools are UN funded, right? So this is a terrifying situation which the world has simply acquiesced to. I mean, the world on some level has simply accepted that there is a different standard held to the Muslim community, right? We all understand that you can stage a play making fun of Mormonism on Broadway and it can become the biggest musical in the United States, the Book of Mormon. But to stage such a play about Islam would be unthinkable, and to be unthinkable not because the First Amendment doesn't protect the freedom of speech with respect to Islam, it does, but that protection has been forfeited. It was forfeited long ago because of the tendency in the Muslim community to erupt with just psychopathic rage in response to what it perceives to be the desecration of religious symbols. And that should be intolerable to us. But it's, we have acquiesced to it. And the new norm is there are certain things you can't say about Islam. There are certain symbols you can't traduce. And it's because we know that tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people will march into the streets, even in the capitals of Europe, in response to those blasphemies.
Could you flip the argument the other way too? Some people would say that the scale, the disproportionate, as many see it, scale of Israel's response is motivated in some part, again, by a religious motivation, that some of the more hardline, ultra-religious members of Netanyahu's cabinet really do want to have some kind of genocidal war with the Muslim Palestinians. I mean, does it work both ways?
Well, it does work both ways when you're talking about a tiny minority of Jews in Israel. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox, the settlers the minority of settlers who are motivated by their religious fanaticism. I think those religious claims upon real estate in the Middle East are not justified, and they aren't, in fact, part of the problem. And so, yes, the settlements in the West Bank are certainly provocative, and they should be disallowed, right? If we were ever going to get to a two-state solution, part of the remedy there is to disenfranchise the religious maniacs on the Israeli side. But in terms of the scale of the problem, it is orders of magnitude smaller. I mean, not just for that particular region, but for the whole world. I mean, we're talking, there are 15 million Jews on Earth. Most of them are impressively secular. Most believe very little that would motivate a person to want to die for their religious identity.
Benjamin Netanyahu tonight, very unequivocal. Israel will keep fighting Hamas until they are eradicated, which means there's going to be months and months more of what we've been seeing. What is your response to that?
Well, as you know, I've called for Netanyahu and the IDF to be brought before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Article 6, 7, and 8, crime of genocide, crime against humanity, and war crime. And what I mean by that is we need to live in a world in which we fundamentally believe that Palestinian suffering has the same value as Jewish suffering. Jewish suffering has the same value as Palestinian suffering. If this were a Palestinian occupation and domination, a Palestinian genocide against Jews in which there were nearly 8,000 precious Jewish babies killed in 50 days, we'd have a qualitatively different discussion, qualitatively different response. And I believe Biden, Harris, Austin, we can go right down the line, Kirby, Blinken, they are complicitous with Israel's war crimes against the Palestinians. Has Hamas committed war crimes? Absolutely, they've committed war crimes, but not crimes of genocide. And when Netanyahu invokes Amalek, 1 Samuel 15:3, in the biblical text, and I speak as a Christian, I know the difference between those divine sanctioned genocidal commands, kill every woman, kill every child in order to procure our end. He's invoked a number of times. October 28th, he's invoked Amalek. That's genocidal intent. And this genocidal attack flowing from that intent. We have to have a moral consistency across the board. Every baby, no matter who they are in the world, have the same value.
Let me go to Eugene then, for your response to that. I mean, you'll be aware, Eugene, that much of the world is now watching with horror the scale of Israel's response. And when they hear Netanyahu saying this isn't going to stop until we've got rid of all of Hamas, and at best estimates, they've only killed 6,000 to 7,000 Hamas terrorists, and that's just if you take IDF's word for it. That means that 80% of Hamas has not been eliminated yet. How many civilians are going to get killed in the next few months or even years before Hamas is eradicated? And how, in the end, does that help either peace in the region, or how does it stop just massive escalation and radicalization against Israel?
So how many civilians will die is largely a function of Hamas's decisions, because Hamas has a specific strategy of trying to kill as many Israeli civilians as they can, as they did on October 7th, and trying to get as many of their own civilians killed, which they do by hiding in tunnels under populated areas, basing themselves in schools, in hospitals. Their strategy is to roll up their civilian death toll, which at the same time, Israel does everything to limit. Israel is only targeting Hamas. Now, Hamas makes it difficult by hiding amongst civilians, and the deaths of those civilians are Hamas war crimes. The accusations of genocide, it's what psychologists call projection, accusing your enemy, the other side, of exactly what you're doing to distract and whitewash what you're doing. October 7th was a genocidal invasion of Israel, where Hamas invaded Israel, chopped up families in front of each other, burned people alive. And now Israel is responding more moderately than any country would.
But let me just put you on that. In terms of its supposed moderate response, in the last few days alone, we've seen the IDF shoot dead 3 Israeli hostages who were wearing no shirts and had a banner asking for help. They were surrendering whoever they were. They turned out to be hostages. Then we had 2 women, innocent women, standing outside a Catholic church who were also gunned down by IDF snipers in an action that the Pope called terrorism. You've also got President Biden describing the bombing campaign as indiscriminate, which in itself, that description implies a war crime. So this idea that Israel's being moderate in its response, I don't think is borne out by reality, is it?
President Biden has actually said, and other American officials have said, that Israel is acting more morally than any other army. Now, show me a war without inadvertent civilian casualties. When America cleared ISIS out of Mosul, 10,000 civilians were killed in that city alone, and America was not fighting an enemy next door that was actively shooting rockets at it and holding its citizens hostage. If Professor West had his way, Nazi Germany would still rule Europe, because, of course, hundreds of thousands of German civilians died in the war against Nazi Germany.
All right, but let me bring
the Confederacy would still rule half of America. Let me just say about the hostages, because that's a sensitive point. That's a tragic incident, of course. And we saw today that the mother of one of the hostages said she does not blame the Israeli soldiers. She embraces them because she knows that Hamas, again, is responsible for their deaths, because Hamas has used every kind of subterfuge to trap Israeli soldiers.
Let me go to
fake surrenders and suicide.
Let me bring back in Cornel West. Cornel West, the moral conundrum here for many people is that what happened on October the 7th was utterly horrific. An appalling terrorist attack on mostly civilian, innocent people.
He's a precious human being.
And when you have, Cornel, here's my question. Here's my question. When you have Hamas stating since October the 7th, we want to do that again and again and again, when it is their mission statement to wipe out Israel and any Jews who live in Israel, when we all can see and hear them say this with brazen impunity, what is Israel supposed to do other than try to remove Hamas?
Hamas is very much like the Jewish Irgun, which is a terrorist group responding to vicious British imperialism that killed innocent Arabs. Every resistance movement against colonialism, domination, and oppression, apartheid-like conditions, you have nonviolent streams, you have nonviolent streams. The first Intifada was nonviolent. The second one was primarily nonviolent, only with rocks. And what did JFK say? When you make nonviolent revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. You had to, with the Jewish Irgun, there's always been terrorist expression. The problem is the IDF, which comes out of Jabotinsky, which was tied to the Jewish and terrorist history, and this is a part of Jewish history. It's not all. There's been the Einsteins and the Albert Magnus and others who call for very different things. But when I hear my brother Eugene say they've only killed Hamas, they killed 2 Christian women in front of a church, a mother and a grandmother. You mean almost 8,000 children are being shielded by Hamas? You really believe the world is going to think that's serious? These justifications are as weak as pre-sweetened Kool-Aid when we see the massive suffering of precious Palestinians who are innocent.